I've just started recording. I don't have my usual setup, so I need to look away from the camera a little bit to look at my lecture notes. I apologize for that. So, welcome. Today is lecture number 21. So we're just towards the end of the class, the last 2 weeks of class. And on Saturday, we began this new section of the class on thinking about data. And since not all of you were here, I'll just point text that we're using, calling bullshit, which I recommend getting hold of. It's an easy read, and again, now that I'm teaching this, I feel like, wow, there's so much more stuff to talk about. So we'll just do a small jhalak of thinking about it. Remind ourselves what do the authors mean by bullshit. And they have a definition somewhere about. Now, by the way, if you read some of this stuff, we'll see quite a lot of examples of. Sorry, I didn't look. I didn't find this. I didn't find the page number for that page. Where is it? Page 4. You'll see that some of the classic concerns that we've looked at in the case of, oh, you know what it calls this version of the PDF doesn't actually have page numbers that match. I am very sorry, but I should actually fix this. So, at the risks of the preface means so page 3 corresponds to page 12. That's 9 pages. And so page 40. Yeah. So let's find here. Here's at least one place that they define bullshit. So again, we have started off in such a confused note. I was going to say that if you read the book, you'll see that the authors are kind of aware of a lot of the critical thinking sorts of questions that we've looked at earlier in the course, things like propaganda, and in a way they want to distinguish what they're interested in from these more classical kinds of things. And one of the reasons they want to do that, the thing they care about is a kind of sloppy thinking that may not be driven by bad intentions, to brainwash people, all of that stuff. It just maybe certain kind of easy thinking. So it may be designed to persuade or impress an audience by distracting, overwhelming, or intimidating them. But the maybe this is where the difference comes with the more classical critical thinking idea. That what makes something bullshit is that you just say it without even caring. You may have no particular interest in lying to this group, or you may not benefit. A lot of the examples they gave are examples from the field of journalism and sorry, of my phones. So examples of bullshit which arise in contexts where the persons in question may not have some kind of vested interest in you believing that particular thing. That's another way in which this material is a bit different. I guess obviously the third is that the subject matter of this material is on data and what we looked at earlier, things like language and reasoning, informal fallacies, though they do talk about things like framing effects um, in a few places. So what I want to do today, so last time we looked at this material in this chapter on causality, and that chapter was essentially about these questions of inferring causality from evidence of associations. The slogan, correlation doesn't imply causation. And what is nice is, I think 2 or 3 lessons from there. One was essentially whenever you see correlations or associations, more generally, think about there may be multiple hypotheses that explain why the correlation exists, and in particular, what's the causal direction, which variables influencing which one, and so that's a skill to develop. When you see some causal thing, ask yourself, well, what's the data on which it's being presented, and are there more than one causes is there more than one causal chain that would explain that correlation? And then if it does turn out that there's more than one hypothesis, then there's a further question which is worth asking yourself, which is, okay, here are these 2 hypotheses. How would I be able to tell between the 2? In what way can I go out into the world and check, or rule out one of the hypotheses, or find confirming evidence for another one? I'm not saying that obviously not all of us are experts in the particular issues that we look at, but at least one of the lessons from this earlier material on Popper and so forth would be to ask yourself, look, is it the kind of thing that in principle one can go out and check, and if not, then that's a red flag. We just had these state elections. I often find sometimes that post-election analysis is this kind of way where people see a bunch of associations. You see how many voters have voted for one party versus another, and then you have a lot of journalists and pundits explaining, well, why did this party do so well, or why did voters vote, and often that's not based on any a story that they tell, something called a just so story, may not have any much bearing on reality. There's a famous example, I don't know if you remember, from I guess 2015, the Bihar elections. So I remember watching the election results, and essentially the news channels started calling it for the BJP, and Shekhar Gupta was the journalist who some of you might be familiar with. He started like this whole story about, this is why the BJP is winning, or has won Bihar, and then suddenly it turned out that this election results is a bit silly, right? Because you don't trends are not going to continue the same way throughout the day unless there's something really overwhelming. But anyway, so it turned out, within a few hours, it seemed like the trend was going the other way. So then he says, here's why BJP is losing Bihar, without batting an eyelid, without saying, oh my God, I had these hypotheses and they're false. So that kind of thing is something to avoid. So today, anyway, so that's the leftover stuff or reflections from the material on causality. And today what I want to talk about is the material from this chapter, which they call numbers and nonsense. And what's the takeaway from this chapter is, um, numbers and equations can be sort of dangerous pathways for bullshit in the technical sense that they define. Because they carry with it a certain kind of authority, and people can be intimidated by. Well, one, they carry about authority. Numbers are hard. Other stuff is soft. And equations and things carry a certain kind of authority. Not everyone's trained to do that. I mean, you guys are an exception, right? So you, as a subset of the population, are probably much more confident, and rightly so, of your ability to think about numbers than the general population. But at least some of the problems with using numbers in a kind of very confident way is that there's kind of stuff, uh, behind the scenes that relate to the interpretation of the numbers. That it does require domain knowledge in some cases, but as hard as just looking at the numbers themselves, absent that kind of domain knowledge, might not get very far, and it can mislead. So what I'm going to do now for the next hour plus is walk through some of their examples and the kinds of lessons they want to draw from the example. But before that, I wanted to give you some kinds of, in the Indian context, some examples of controversies and really subtleties that have arisen in the interpretation of data. And India is a country that historically, in fact, had a very good record of collecting statistical data on things like, employment rates, or health, poverty. Anyone heard? What are the major surveys that the government of India conducts to study, let's say, poverty in this country, or health, for that matter? Anyone? If you wanted to understand poverty rates in India and how they've changed over the years, what's the most comprehensive place you look at? Yes.
The census.
Yeah. The census would be one. Anyone else? Anything else?
Yes, sir, the percentage of people.
I lost. You said the percentage. Right. I lost what you said. I think there's some problem with audio at your end in general. Last time also there's an issue. Well, I was just going to say. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sir, I would say based on census, the percentage of people, and we can also calculate the exact amount on which decent life can be lived in the India at that time, and right now at current time, and based on that we can calculate the percentage of people below that amount that we calculated, and relate both, compare both.
Okay, I was going to give you the name of a survey that's much more not reliable. Census is quite reliable, but is much more periodic, called the National Sample Survey. And there's something called the National Health Survey. So if you take a class in development economics with somebody like Ritika Khera in our department, I would encourage you to do that. Then she, this is her bread and butter, is thinking about these sorts of surveys and what they say about poverty estimates. If you remember that short answer question on the two definitions of poverty, it's an important thing to remember when somebody says poverty has gone up or poverty has gone down, or the situation of poverty in our country is so grave, what's the underlying definition that they're using? Often you won't know what that is, but in fact you can get different numbers based on what definition you're using, and it may be that for different purposes, different definitions are appropriate. And it's a particularly interesting case in the context of studying changes in poverty over time, because, for instance, if you want to study changes in poverty over time, then you better have a constant definition of poverty, right? To have the same, but you need to adjust it for things like inflation. So these are actually very, very complex decisions, and you shouldn't always assume that the people making these decisions are getting it right. So, like I said, historically, India has had a very, very world-famous kind of statistical infrastructure, which, by all accounts, is kind of broken down in the last 10 years or so, and particularly now, I think, when I post some pieces on that. There's a famous man, I don't know if you know this name, P.C. Mahalanobis. Anyone heard of that name? So he's the man who, amongst other things, set up the Indian Statistical Institute. And he's also responsible for getting the Planning Commission, which is the name of what is now called the Niti Aayog, put in a kind of infrastructure there. So yeah, historically we've been, I think, global kind of leaders on these issues, though I think now that reputation has sunk pretty fast. But anyway, the point, all I'm saying is, when you look at a figure about what's the state of poverty in India today, a lot might depend upon how you define that figure, if it makes sense. If you think of something like unemployment, for instance, it turns out that most measures of unemployment are measures of people who are looking for work but not getting work. So what is that? If that was if they're like, I don't know, 30% of people between the age of 20 and 25 are unemployed, and if what's being measured is that's people who applied for jobs and haven't got it, what are you missing out?
People who didn't apply to jobs, who couldn't.
Yeah, there may be a whole range of people who've just given up, right? Or maybe who are going on to higher studies, let's say, because they are not because they want to, but because they have no other economic opportunities. So careful social scientists are very good about keeping these things in mind, how to interpret data, but the same data then can be used in all sorts of careless, sometimes scrupulous ways. One thing that I have taught, actually not in this class, but in this class of criminal justice that I used to teach, is if you think of crime rates, you ask yourself, maybe has the crime rate in a city gone up? How do you measure crime rates in a city?
Probably using police statistics.
And what statistics might the police use?
So this would only count reported crimes and not all crimes.
So would count reported crimes. So what do you think might be at issue with, let's say, suppose I say in Jaipur, rape cases in Jaipur have gone up, by a huge number in the last 5 years. What might be? Yeah.
Might be that because of general policy changes, more people are coming and telling the police about rapes, which would otherwise have not told the police, because
that's right. So in some cases, especially I think in the case of things like domestic violence and rape, it might seem in a particular city or a jurisdiction that, wow, these rates are really going up. Well, that might not be a reflection of, the underlying situation. It might actually be a good thing because it's showing that more people are coming forward and reporting this. So again, you see a headline in a newspaper that says this. Yeah, go ahead.
In this case, not can we reporting has increased, or like in it may be case that cases are also increasing.
It might be, yeah. So my point is, yeah, go ahead.
I think both cases may happen. Like crimes are increasing as well as the reporting are also
Sure.
increasing.
It's obviously it's going to be a case by case basis, right? There's no reason to say it has to be this. At least all I'm saying is, if you look at the number of FIRs registered, that's can tell a story that may be misleading. So then you'd have to do more work, right? You'd have to do more work on understanding, exactly what's going on. And that's what I meant. You may have to just check the world, and it's hard, right? How do you estimate 5 years ago how many crimes were committed that were not reported? It's very, very hard to do. So historically, there've been debates, for instance, about actually in the census, in poverty estimation. So one way in which people estimated, nutritional status is they ask people, well, tell us what you've eaten in the last 7 days, and people will think back to the last 7 days and ask, say something to the census enumerators. And it turned out that there was a change. I can't remember when. I think in the early 2000s, to the recall period. It either went from a 7-day recall period to a 30-day recall period. That is, people ask you, what have you eaten in the last month? Or it went the other way around. What might be different between having a 7-day recall period and a 30-day recall period?
So you remember less about your last month than you remember about the last.
You may remember less.
Additionally, weeks would have a higher variance.
You may have you ask the week after
Big party
crop
or
harvest or whatever. Maybe you'll get a quite different number from, especially if you're a farm worker or a farmer. There are another interesting kind of example is that sometimes in a census or in whatever study you have particular boxes, right? You think you're trying to collect this kind of data, you have a sense of the sort of data you want to collect, but sometimes those boxes themselves may not reflect reality. So I think famously around partition, I mean, there's questions of enumerating how many people in a given area are Hindu versus how many are Muslim. And it turns out for many communities, or at least this was true maybe 50 years ago, that wasn't an easy question for them to answer, because they would think of, they'd have some practices that are more Hindu in nature, some practices that are more Islamic in nature. The community that is mentioned in this context is the Meos in Rajasthan. So that's another form of potential distortion. Maybe the categories we go in with may not be that. They seem so obvious to us, but they may not be. To take one example that we'll discuss a little bit more, if you think of college rankings, for instance, IIT rankings, how are rankings done? What is the top ranked IIT right now?
Top rank IIT, I think it's IIT Bombay.
Okay, and on what basis would
I think no. You are there are two rankings, sir. Basically, Indian government has also a department which is ranking IITs on their parameters, and world ranking is on other parameters. So basically, it's
so what are the parameters?
parameter in that parameter. I think there are revenues as well. There are how much revenue and how much foreign students are studying in that college. How many foreign professors are teaching there, and
So if you're
education criteria like. Uh,
so if you were, for instance, if you were looking at if you got into if you cleared the JEE and you have to decide which IIT to join, and you're asking yourself, look, let me go to the highest ranked IIT. Like, why should it matter whether it has more international students? It may matter, it may not.
Because QS ranking is done, it's also IIT director Professor Rao also told this, that we are basically government colleges, so we are only taking Indian students. We can't take foreign students in BTech level at BTech level. That's why our ranking, we are getting zero in that parameter or in that column.
So good. So what I'm trying to get you.
That's why IIT is not in top 100. Otherwise, IIT really is under top 50 in engineering and education, basically.
But what I would like you, and I wish we had more time to talk about rankings, but my takeaway would actually be that, I'm not sure that the rankings make that much sense. Because the rankings suggest that, look, there's this kind of objective criteria.
It matters in job, like more companies refer their to their college students, because like tier one colleges are the students which are who are studying in tier 1 colleges will be getting more money than tier 2 and tier 3.
No, sure. But that's a function of already having that ranking, right? The question
Yeah.
is, what is the ranking actually telling you about? The ranking is useful information because it's being used by other people as proxy for something. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But in fact, independent of that kind of reputational impact, we have to tell me very seriously about, for instance, what's the quality of education that you do.
So,
Yeah.
like there is there is a difference in quality between different colleges, right? And
I don't know, maybe in some dimension. I think these are very multi-dimensional things, right?
yes, but like in at least some dimension, like all colleges are not the same. Some must be worse and some would be better, because otherwise they must all be the same, right?
Right.
So like that is what people are trying to measure, but it's a very hard thing to measure, and so you get all these different sorts of rankings which measure different sorts of easily measured things.
So the key question is, when you see a ranking, for instance, well, what is it being measured is one question, and the other more important question is, like, how important is that thing for your purposes, the thing that is being measured. And often you'll find that because well, again, we'll talk about in this section of the chapter they have on what's called Goodhart's law. Often you find something, people will prefer a proxy that, there may be proxies for something. You care about research quality, and you use as a proxy for research quality the number of citations that a person's faculty member's research has created. What might be the problem with that kind of measure?
Like I can't think of a particular problem, but like it is pretty clearly a proxy, right? Like
it's a proxy.
It is you are not even checking what the person has researched on. You are just checking a simple number which tells you something, but it does not tell you a lot of, like, you are missing a lot of information there.
So if you take
I can't think of a particular issue with it, probably because I don't particularly know much about the systems that are there in the paper.
Well, here's an example of something that you may be missing, right? A university that has a very large proportion of very young faculty, is going to have, people who are at the start of their career, it's going to have less citations than people who are later on in the career. Even if you have the most brilliant researchers at your university, if they're 2 or 3 years out of their PhD, maybe they're going to show less citations. I mean, that is just an example. What I'm trying to get you to see with these different kinds of examples is to be just attuned to the subtlety of some of these issues, which are often presented sometimes by the media, but also by the organizations that sometimes generate these numbers. They present them as having a certain kind of validity or a certain gravity that I think is worth. I don't think these numbers are worthless. I think in many cases the numbers are not worthless. But what you can get from the numbers, that's quite a subtle question. And again, in the field of economics, at least, if you're interested in this kind of thing, just take a class with Ritika or Shauram or Ankush, Jay, and my colleagues. Another debate, by the way, which we'll talk about towards the end of the class. Sometimes people make estimates. It's particularly true in the field of public policy. So there was this. You don't see this anymore, but certainly when I was younger, there was this quotation from Rajiv Gandhi about how he said that 15% of government spending on poverty alleviation and stuff, that was a 15% leakage due to corruption. And it's not at all clear, like, who did the study that came up with the 15%. This kind of became this acceptable piece of wisdom that people started quoting all over the place, and often as a ground to say, hey, we shouldn't fund these poverty programs because there's so much corruption, or we should spend all our time policing the corruption. You see the same thing in the context of savings from Aadhaar. So in fact, last time I taught this course, I taught this article by have any of you taken the class with her, or have you come across her work? Huh?
Who?
No,
Oh, you can see this, right? I'm talking about Ritika Khera. Can you see the?
yes, sir. We have. I think I have seen this name in mail many times.
Yeah.
Sir, I have a course and
You had Kartika. You had a course with her.
yeah, my intro to economics was taken by Ritika.
Okay, so she's somebody who thinks a lot about these issues, and she's a very staunch, I would say, opponent of Aadhaar, but a staunch questioner of some of the claims that are made on behalf of Aadhaar. And one of her points is that sometimes the people who make these claims, numerical claims, how much savings are going to accrue if we adopt this technology, they're based on assumptions that maybe hidden, or maybe people haven't thought through that much. But again, they can take on a kind of life of their own. So I'll post a couple of articles she wrote about on this issue, and I think I have the recorded guest lecture from her talk last semester, so I'll put that up. I have one recorded lecture from her, then from a couple of semesters back, a talk on crime data, how to think about crime data. And on Thursday, we'll have a talk on how to think about COVID data. So that will hopefully give you some sense of how these issues play out in real world contexts in India. So this is, I guess, this big picture sorts of questions that are worth asking yourself when you see a number being quoted in an authoritative kind of way. Sort of what is being measured. Is what is being measured something you actually care about? Are there disagreements about the the way that measurement should be defined. We'll talk a little bit about sampling in the context of next week, in the context of looking at some of Kahneman stuff. But let's go, unless there are any particular questions on what I've said so far, let's go to the text that's assigned for today. Any questions or thoughts on what I've just said? No? Okay. So let's West and Jevons, essentially, as in the previous chapter, right? This is a whole bunch of different examples that then are taken to, used to extract some sorts of lessons. One general point that they make is, and maybe you should tell me if in school you looked at these kinds of things. Like, have you looked at these questions, like, how to think about summary statistics like medians and means? When is a mean appropriate? When is a median appropriate? What kinds of information are left out? Is that something you discuss?
What? I didn't listen clearly.
Okay, you didn't listen clearly in class, or you didn't hear what I said clearly?
Yeah.
When they were
No,
teaching you
I
statistics?
didn't listen. Can you please explain? Can you please explain?
Okay. Let me just give you the example. Let me give you the example, and then we can talk about it. I'm going to give you this example from hang on. Again, because of this lack of numbers here, I get very confused as I'm reading the hard copy. There's an example that they gave. Oh, it's right in the start of the chapter. It is a nice example of percentages. Here. Why don't somebody read?
I will go. I will read.
Yeah, go ahead.
In these examples.
Yeah.
In these examples, we are observing a population with a range of values, a range of heights, for instance, and then summarizing that information with a single number that we call a summary statistic. For example, when describing the tall Dutch, we reported a mean height. Summary statistics can be a nice way to condense information, but if you choose an inappropriate summary statistic, you can easily mislead your audience. Politicians use this trick when they propose a tax cut that will save the richest 1% of the population hundreds of thousands of dollars, but offer no tax reduction whatsoever to the rest of us. Taking a mean of the tax cuts, they report that their tax plan will save families an average $4,000 per year. Maybe so, but the average family, if by that we mean one in the middle of the income range, will save nothing. The majority of us would be better off knowing the tax cut for a family with the median income. The median is the middle income. Half of US families earn more than half and half earn less. In this particular case, the median family would get no tax cut at all because the tax cut benefits only the top 1%.
Like that
Sometimes
example,
one
right?
can.
You can stop, Hemant. So people get that. There are many situations where averages, understood as means at least, can be quite deceptive. What are some other situations where seeing an average understood as a mean, they give you an inaccurate picture of whatever it is you're trying to measure? Let's say in the case of development, for instance. No? So suppose I said in a particular country, I said, look, India is not a great example for this, but I said, look, such and such country is doing pretty well because it has such a high per capita income. When I say per capita income, that's a mean, right? So, what might be missing? What might be misleading about thinking about the development of a country through per capita income?
The distribution of the
I
income.
think it's just basically income disparity or whatever.
That's right. Question of distribution, right? You have like one very rich person and
Like in
thousand
US,
very poor people.
I read a report in which told that only 1% you Americans have 70% as income.
And I think again, I can't remember the statistics for India, but it's it's pretty.
In India, it's also around 67 or 68.
Okay. So that's just one example. Again, think about for whatever problem it is that we are concerned about, what's the most appropriate form of statistic to use. Then I'm going to skip. They have this discussion, a long discussion about whiskey, and essentially how to the same phenomenon. The phenomenon is that when you put whiskey in a barrel to age, because you have to buy whiskey, and there's no reason why you guys should know this, but expensive whiskey is aged in wooden barrels, and so a whole bunch of it evaporates in the process. And all that they're doing in this example is just showing all the different ways in which you might report essentially the same fact, and not much more to it than that. I'm not sure if a more practical example. I had to think about a more practical example that would make a difference for us to think about. Maybe we'll see it on Thursday. I think thinking about the effects of COVID may be an example of this question of how to report a number may end up being quite important. The next section, which is quite nice, talks about percentages and a whole bunch of different points they make about when to think in terms of absolute numbers and when to think in terms of percentages, which should we use in thinking about what kinds of comparisons. That's kind of the thing we're interested in. So he has this example. And as you see, they also take off from this thinking about that Carl Sagan reading that we did. And the example they give here is of a kind that actually we've seen both in Sagan and also Feynman, right? That if you don't have a comparison class that says 99.9% caffeine free, well, maybe coffee is also 99.9% coffee, caffeine free. When you look at this, you may think, hey, this has very little caffeine, and so I don't have to worry about taking it before bedtime. But because the comparison class is not identified, that statistic by itself might be quite misleading. The more interesting cases are cases like this. So Hemant, why don't you continue reading this example, because it's a nice.
Notorious.
Breitbart was a news portal. Yeah.
Of course, or a notorious Breitbart.
Yeah.
Okay. A notorious Breitbart headline similarly denies readers the opportunity to make meaningful comparisons. This particular bit of scaremongering proclaimed that 2,139 of the dream recipients, undocumented who came to the United States as children had been convicted or accused of crimes against Americans. That sounds like a big number,
Just pause for a
scary
second.
number.
Hang on. Just pause for a second. The politics of this is that if you're against, against immigration or against people who, are not of American descent, then, and you see this figure, you see that, look, 2,000 people who came into America essentially illegally, people who came in illegally while they were children. There might be people coming in from Latin America, for instance, let's say. And if you're a politician who thinks,
saying that 2,139 people are those who came America illegally and
no,
and crime.
2,139 of the people who came. So off is important. So carry on reading. I just wanted to give you the context. Carry on.
That sounds like a big number, a scary number. But of course, the Dream Act pertains to a huge number of people. Nearly 7 lakh people held DSCA status concurrently, and nearly 8 lakh were granted DSCA status at some point before the program was eliminated. This means that only about 0.3% of all DSCA recipients, fewer than 1 in 300, have been accused of crimes against Americans. That sounds better.
So DACA, what this act did was that it kind of it's like an amnesty. If you came as a child, from Latin America to escape poverty or something, and you came in to the US before a certain age, then what this act did was it kind of regularized your status. So, and this is why it was controversial and eventually overturned. So he's saying that there were 7 lakh people or maybe 8 lakh people who had come to the US as children who were not, who came illegally essentially, but where this act had made them into US citizens. Carry on.
But that sounds better. But how does this number compare to similar rates for American citizens? With 0.7% of Americans behind bars, US citizens are twice as likely to be presently incarcerated as DSCA recipients are to have been accused of a crime. About 8.6% of American citizens have been convicted of a felony at some point in their lives, making the DSCA population look better still. Of
Okay,
course.
so just pause there, right? So you can see there that if I was a TV show host who was against this policy, then what I would do is focus on this number, and it's such a big number. Whereas, and this would show that this is a population of people who can't be trusted. We need to prevent people from coming into the country or refuse them citizenship if they do. Whereas if I was somebody who's in favor of that policy, the thing to do is maybe to look at this. It's only 0.3%, and that's less than half, at least, of people, American citizens who are actually behind bars. So one take-home lesson is essentially don't ignore denominators. At least sometimes denominators are very important. What's a case in recent history which has been in some ways a source of controversy, which involves denominators in India?
Can you say about Rohingya Muslims, Rohingya refugees?
I didn't think of that. I just don't know enough of the statistical issue there.
We don't know exact numbers.
I was thinking of COVID vaccinations. So if you report COVID vaccinations in absolute terms, right, then they're very big numbers. But if you report them as percentages, then the big numbers don't matter that much. Right? Maybe what matters in a country is what percentage of the country is vaccinated, rather than from a public health perspective, for instance, that may be the number to think about rather than the absolute numbers of people vaccinated. Maybe that's the case where you do want a percentage as opposed to an absolute number. But then, as the authors point out, sometimes the reverse might be true. So, Hemant, why don't you then continue reading this blog post?
In a blog post, Google VP of Engineering Ben Jong Gongs acknowledged the problems that their company faces from fake news, disinformation, and other inappropriate content. Our algorithms help identify reliable sources from the hundreds of billions of pages in our index. However, it's become a very rampant, apparent that a small set of queries in our daily traffic, around 0.2%, have been returning offensive or clearly misleading content, which is not what people are looking for. Two things are going on here. First, a large and largely irrelevant number is presented as if it helps set the context. Hundreds of billions of pages in our index juxtaposed against the vast number is a tiny 1.25%. But the hundreds of billions figure is largely irrelevant. It is the number of pages indexed, not anything about the number of search queries. It doesn't matter whether 10,000 or 100 billion pages are indexed. If 0.25% of Google searches are misleading, you have a 1 in 400 chance of getting bullshit in your search results. We are not told how many search queries Google handles per day, but estimates place this figure at about 5.5 billion queries a day. So with 0.25% sounds small, it corresponds to well over 13 million queries a day. These two ways of saying the same thing have very different connotations. If we tell you that Google is returning inappropriate search results only one time in 400, the system seems pretty sound. But if we tell you that more than 13 million queries return inappropriate and inaccurate content every day, it sounds as though we are facing a serious crisis in information delivery. Percentage can be
Pause there.
particularly.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can stop now. Right. So sometimes thinking in terms of percentages may obscure issues because the issues of concern actually are absolute numbers. Can you
I'm
think of
not
an
sure.
example? Yeah.
In this case, why is it obscuring? Like in this case, percentage is the correct thing to focus on, right?
Is it? What would
Yes.
you? Why would you care about this issue?
Because you want to know that if you use Google, what are the chance that you'll get bad results, right? That's
Well,
what you
that's
care
one
about.
question. Is that the only thing you might care about? Might you not also want to care about, um, absolute numbers of people who are misled?
I'm not sure, like, but that would require comparing against different things, right? Like, um, I think I'm not sure if this is clear, but it matters what you're comparing it against. Yes, sir, that's what I'm saying. Like, I thought that this was about how good Google is essentially.
No, I think
So
this is not about how good Google is. This is about um, uh, how big a problem is it? How big a problem is fake news? That's the issue. Not about, at least in the way the authors are pointing out, this is not about necessarily criticizing Google for doing a bad job. Maybe a very, that 0.25 figure may be very, very good. But if what you care about is in a democracy, how much fake news is floating around.
I'm still not sure why we would not categorize how much fake news as a percentage of, for example, all news. That still seems like a more natural measure to me.
Okay, other thoughts? If you feel like this is not a good example, can you think of other examples where, for the problem we're interested in? So this is an important thing. Right? It's always going to be these questions about what is the right way to present data. What is the right question? It's always relative to some question you're interested in. Can you think of other examples?
Like there was that coffee one, right? And that the percentage of useless, you only care about the amount of caffeine you're getting, because the amount of caffeine acts on your body, not the percentage of caffeine.
Okay, so that's nice. That's one example. What else?
Like that, like it's not easy to randomly think of stuff.
Anyone else? I was thinking that again, if you think of a COVID example, the slogan that people maybe is familiar to, but if for instance, it turns out that COVID fatality rates are something like I don't know, 1%, or is that right? Basically, is it roughly 1%? If you're the health minister of a country or a state, and you look at the percentage figure, you might think, yeah, look, this is really small, so I don't have to worry about the healthcare system. What is the
I
mistake?
think, but 1% of what number? 1% of what? That also matters. 1%
of what number?
of
Exactly.
1 million, 1 million, or 10 million, or 1 billion.
So that's a case
That
where
matters.
maybe, for instance, if you're interested in your health infrastructure, can your hospitals support the volume of patients who might come? Do you how much oxygen do you need? Like, those are questions that.
But that doesn't depend on the mortality rate at all, right? Like, why would you care about how many people die in that one? You care about how many people are infected.
Fair enough, but so maybe the mortality rate is the wrong figure to look at. But my point is, there was this the slogan that people came, that what is it? A small fraction of a large number is still a large number, right? A very large number. Did you come across that slogan?
No.
I mean, you might care about mortality for other reasons. What's the reason why you might care about absolute mortality rates? Sorry, absolute mortality numbers. Hey, you may. I mean, it's a grisly kind of thing to think about. Maybe you need to think about how many crematoria you need. Let's say. You may need to think about, okay, look, I need to. How much money should I assign to this problem? If I'm faced with if the problem is stated in terms of percentages, I might end up not responding to it with the kind of gravity or urgency that it requires.
So I still think that in a general sense, percentages are usually better, because they sort of also tell you about the base in which the things are happening, right? Like.
But it's precisely that they don't, right? The issue here is that if they don't tell you the base, then you're going to forget. You're going to think of the problem as much smaller than it actually is.
They exactly tell you about the relative sizes, right? And I'm like, what I'm saying, that relative sizes are usually more useful than absolute sizes, because people don't have much of a difference between, say, 1 million or 10 million. But between 1% and 10%, you can understand the difference much easier. Like it makes it. Do you get what I'm trying to get at?
No, I get that. But what I try to get you to see is that for different kinds of problems.
No, I agree. I'm saying that in a general sense, I think in a general sense, percentages are usually better, because most of the numbers we encounter in such cases are so big that we have basically no intuition for them. And percentages bring them in the area where we do have intuition.
Fair enough. So that's partly just an issue of scale, right? They scale down percentages, scale down numbers by the baseline. I think my point would be that I don't know if there's a general answer to be had. What would be nice, what you don't get, but what you think about more is like a kind of rule of thumb. What are the kinds of cases or kinds of questions for which one should forget about the denominator, and what are the kinds of cases and questions where what you might really care about is the absolute rather than the relative. So I guess whenever let's say whenever you have to have an expenditure of some kind of resource that requires thinking about absolute numbers, then it may be misleading when you're given only a percentage, because humanly, like a 1% doesn't seem like such a big deal. But again, it's going to be dependent on the context that you're asking the question. So then they have a nice example, in fact, which has to do with some of this stuff is very basic. Where's that example? This is the example I have in mind. Somebody else read? We've had Hemant read quite a bit.
Sir, we are running out of time already. 6:10 as well, so I should go.
Okay, go ahead.
Reporting numbers.
Yeah.
Reporting numbers as percentages can obscure important changes in net values. For example, the US incarcerates African Americans at a shockingly high rate relative to numbers of other groups. African Americans are more than
You guys know what incarceration means? Eh? Putting in jail.
putting in jail.
Incarceration means putting in somebody in jail.
I was thinking that throwing them out of country. Okay. African Americans are more than 5 times as likely as whites to be in jail or prison. In the year 2000, African Americans composed 12.9% of the US population, but a staggering 41.3% of the inmates in US jails. Given that, it would seem to be good news that between the year 2000 and the year 2005, the fraction of the jail population that was African American declined from 41.3% to 38.9%. But the real story isn't as increasing as the percentage figures seem to indicate. Over this period, the number of African Americans in US jails actually increased by more than 13%. But this increase is obscured by the fact that over the same period, the number of Caucasians in US jails,
Caucasians meaning whites, essentially.
Caucasians in US jails increased by an even larger fraction, 27%. This is an example of a more general issue with comparisons that involve fractions or percentage. Changing denominators obscure changes in numerators. The numerator, the top part of the fraction. Here, the number of jailed African Americans increased substantially from 2000 to 2005, but the denominator, the bottom part of the fraction, here the total number of jailed Americans increased by an even larger proportion over the same period. As a result, African Americans made up a smaller fraction of the incarcerated population in 2005 than they did in 2000. The fact that in 2000 and 2005 more African Americans were locked up than ever before is obscured by this challenging denominator.
Changing denominator. So you see the issue there, that again, depending on the question one's asking, is the situation of African Americans in the American criminal justice system improving or not? Well, the percentage rate is reduced, but many more of them are in jail because the situation of whites is decreasing at the same time. And we can maybe assume that we hold population constant, we control for that. So people see that kind of example. Let's do one thing. We have time, as Hemant reminds us. We only have one, maybe 10, 15 minutes left. So I want to talk a little bit about this thing, Goodhart's law. And the example that they give is an example where people wanted to give an incentive to rat catchers to reduce the rat population. in Hanoi, and so the incentive was a bounty. You show us this proof that you have killed a rat, and we'll give you a certain amount of money for that. And the proof was you show us the tail of a dead rat. And essentially, what people did was just uh, cut off the tail, leave the rats to reproduce, and also uh, raising rats in captivity to harvest their tails. Right? So people respond when an incentive is given to change someone's behavior, people can respond to those incentives in ways that you may not want them to. I find my 2-year-old son, I don't like to praise him for cleaning. Sometimes if somebody's dropped some food or whatever, then and he cleans it up from the floor, thank you, good job or whatever. But then one day I saw that he actually threw something on the floor and then cleaned it up. I thought, hey, the point of praising you for cleaning up is not that I want you to just create the mess and then clean it up. So then that's another case where maybe the praise for cleaning up is the wrong kind of incentive. So the examples that they give, here's the formulation. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And yeah, Hemant, you can just well, I think maybe it's a useful thing to just since we were talking about rankings, just read this paragraph, having to do with rankings. This is a very different admission system from the Indian system, but carry on, the same thing.
The same thing happens even when you are not offering rewards directly. Take college rankings such as the one compiled by US News and World Report. This survey accounts for numerous aspects of colleges, including the acceptance rates for applicants and the average SAT scores of the incoming classes. Once these college
The SAT is this exam, the standardized aptitude test. It's like a
these
general
colleges
purpose exam. Yeah.
rankings began to influence the number of applicants, admissions departments started to play the angles to lower their acceptance rates and thereby appear more selective. Some schools aggressively recruited applications even from students unlikely to be admitted. Many schools switched to the common application so that candidates would apply by simply checking a box to get credit for teaching small classes. Some universities kept many class size at 18 or 19, just below the US News and World Report class size cutoff of 20 to lift their
Okay, so you just call that. You get the idea, right? That
Yes, sir.
once you have a metric, then a system, a metric is supposed to measure something that you care about. Like, your ranking is supposed to measure, uh, in this case, uh, the metric in question is how attractive should that be for a student to be in that university. But then when you have that metric, then the university itself might change its behavior so that it just gets better at that metric. And in the sad case, in the sad kind of scenario is where the underlying behavior, once you move towards the metric, actually takes away from the thing the metric is supposed to capture. So the example that they give is standardized testing, right? So why don't you read from the top of this achievement tests?
Achievement tests may well be valuable indicators of general school achievement under conditions of normal teaching aimed at general competence, but when test scores become the goal of the teaching process, they both lose their value as indicators of educational status and distort the educational process in undesirable ways. If no one knew that you were going to evaluate schools by looking at test scores of students, test scores might provide a reasonable way of measuring schools' effectiveness. But once teachers and administrators recognize that test scores will be used to evaluate their effectiveness, they have every incentive to find ways of raising their students' scores even at the expense of the quality of their education. They may teach to the test. For example, rather than teaching critical thinking, the consequences are twofold. Once this happens, test scores lose much of their value as a means of assessing a school's performance. The process of measurement may even actively undermine the quality of education as time and effort are shifted away from valuable activity and toward the kind of memorization but that improves test scores but is nearly useless from an educational perspective. The same problem occurs in the science as well.
So is that a familiar thing to you guys? You come across um, this phenomenon in your own lives?
I think, sir, basically in India. This is in our education system. This happens every day. This is the
Yeah,
case
like
because
how?
your score matters everywhere.
So the point is not that your score matters. The issue is, does focusing on the score take away from what that score is supposed to measure? That's the issue. But I think you're right. I think it is something that the Indian education system
I think
has problems
I
with.
have heard something. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but I have heard something that in like I am from Rajasthan. So basically, in RBSC board, our state board is giving students more and more marks, so that they could enter in DU colleges because DU colleges cutoffs are so high. So I
I
have
see.
heard
Um,
just for admission in DU, they are giving marks to students.
I don't know if that's a uh, an instance of this phenomenon. But here's a case of something that I think is an instance of this phenomenon. I think um, if you think about extracurricular activities, for instance, and you might think um, the reason that in some application process for internships or jobs, we're not going to only look at the student's examination, but also we're going to look at kind of how well-rounded the student is and what that student is uh, interested in. What might end up happening is then you have a lot of people who have an incentive now to do something that will seem to be an extracurricular activity, even though they're not actually interested in that thing. Do you see that around you? It used to be a
Yes, sir,
complaint
it's big.
of at IIT that people
Yes,
are. Yeah.
yes, sir. Of course, we have this issue recently.
So I think that would be a case of Goodhart's law, where again, perfectly reasonable thing to
Because
you might think, yeah.
because extracurricular activity is not like many students who came from like villages or from small schools. They have not done their schools, but a lot of students who came from top English medium schools they have done in their colleges, in their schools.
Right.
So basically, they are taking more advantage of
So good.
this current
So that's another problem.
extracurricular activity.
Right. So one problem is that um,
And
it
interviewer, when interviewer asks me or any person that what have you done apart from your academics, so how can I answer that question? Because they should know that from what background I have come here.
so sure. So that's another problem. So and I think it's a deep problem. I think our education system. I mean, it reproduces a lot of inequalities that exist, and you know, you think a system as it goes along should try and like uh, reduce inequalities, but I think ours, in some ways
Yes,
at least, perhaps
it's increasing. It's
reinforces them.
increasing. Inequality is increasing in the system,
Yeah.
I think.
But so I agree with that, but that I don't think is an example of the phenomenon that the authors of the book are talking about. That's a more narrow uh, kind of case. Once you start focusing on a number and looking at that number, then the system is going to respond
Also,
to.
what does this author wants from us? Like, what example I can provide?
Well, I just provided an example, but the authors of the book provide these examples as well. Right? The point is that um, um, And it's not as the CV example gave, it's not specifically a point about numbers, but it's a point about metrics. That once you're in the business of ranking and measuring things, the system itself is going to respond to try and beat those metrics, even though I may have wanted that metric as an initial kind of because it was useful initially because it was a proxy for something I cared about. But once it becomes an incentive to respond to that metric, then it's no longer a useful proxy. That's the point that they're making. I feel like Karthikeya, you were saying something about this last time, right? Or there was some context in which we were having, somebody in the class was having this discussion with me last week. Was it you?
For me, it was kind of a different. Means probably yes. Means I guess we did talk about the differences that a background can bring. But
I didn't mean
it was
social background.
Different direction.
Achha, I was talking about this particular difference that they identify, that when something is a metric, then the use of a metric can be very distorting, and therefore that's one reason why sometimes one should be skeptical of metrics, because they may no longer capture what it is that they were initially intended to capture. That's the kind of take home from the book. Okay, so any questions, thoughts, comments people have on this material, or on how to apply it, or it's pretty straightforward stuff. It's not conceptually that deep. But I think it is a useful exercise. The next time you read a newspaper or look at a blog post or something on social media that has numbers in it, to ask yourself these questions. I mean, there's other stuff in the chapter which I haven't covered. Stuff having to do with dimensionality and things. So just to ask these questions, is the number measuring anything meaningful? Is the presentation of the number capturing the aspects that we would like to know about, in the context of thinking about that particular problem? That's it's really that set of questions that should become like a habit to think about. Those are just two questions useful to extract from these texts, these sorts of rules of thumb or questions. Nope, nothing else. So Subeda said inflation in Germany before World War I. I don't know enough about the. Was it before World War I or before World War II, like in the Great Depression?
I think it was before World War II, I think. I also want to say this.
But the point was what? The point was that inflation was extremely high, and so?
Yeah, the thing was ki German government thought that their standards or whatever are measured by how much like money they have. So they end up printing so much money that the money lost its value, and like kind of an analogy between metric and like.
Because again, now the metric that was originally supposed to capture some underlying economic truth is no longer capturing that truth because the government is trying to respond to that metric. That's the fact. Fair enough. Okay, guys. So I'll see you. I've posted a tutorial reading, which is from Kahneman's book, and this stuff is, as you can see, it's not that difficult. The ideas are cool. And then on Thursday we'll have this guest lecture on COVID data. Yeah. Okay. See you, folks.
What will we do in next class?
Next class is a guest lecture. It's this person who's been studying COVID data, and it's about how to think about it. So
input ratings you have already shared.
Yeah.
Or do we have an extra class on Saturday?
No, we don't. We've now caught up on our classes. there's a tutorial which I had a extra tutorial on this
I think
Saturday for Friday, so we don't have to have the we won't have the tutorial on Saturday. We'll just have it on Friday.
on Saturday and Friday we don't have tutorial.
No, we'll have a usual tutorial on Friday.
Okay.
This coming
Not-
Saturday is an extra. This coming Saturday is an extra Friday to make up for Holi.
Yeah, I know.
Right.
That's what I was asking.
So since we already made up for Holi, we don't have to do anything on Friday or on Saturday. I'll
Okay,
send a
so
message. So there's
so
no.
basically next class we are not supposed to read anything, or do we suppose
No.
are you
No reading for next class.
Okay. That's what I was asking. Thank you, sir.
I know. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, sir.